The morning it happened, the shop smelled like burnt rubber and last night's coffee. That detail always stayed with him. Not the humiliation itself, not her voice, not the way she looked at him, but the smell. Coffee gone cold and rubber gone wrong. That was the smell of the worst 30 seconds of his working life. Thomas Harding had been running the same auto shop on Dundas Street West for 11 years. He'd inherited the lease from his uncle and the reputation from nobody. He'd built that himself, one honest job at a time. The sign above the door was faded now. He kept meaning to repaint it. He never did because there was always something more pressing. A transmission that needed pulling, a fuel line that needed tracing, or a parent-teacher interview he almost forgot about until his daughter reminded him the night before with a sticky note on the bathroom mirror. She was 9. She had her mother's habit of writing things down and her father's habit of assuming everyone would eventually figure it out. Her name was June. She'd been coming to the shop on Tuesday afternoons for 2 years, ever since the after-school program lost its funding, and Thomas couldn't afford the private one across town. She sat at the small table he'd set up near the parts shelves, the one with the mismatched legs he'd fixed with a bolt and a prayer, and she did her homework there while he worked. She drew pictures when the homework was done. Cars, mostly. Sometimes dogs. Once, a very ambitious skyline that Thomas had taped to the wall above the old radio. It was a Tuesday when Sylvia Marchetti walked in. Thomas knew who she was the moment she stepped through the door, though he'd never met her personally. Marchetti was the kind of name that showed up in the business pages of the Toronto Star, the kind of face that appeared on panels at conventions he'd never attend. She was the CEO of Marchetti Capital, a mid-sized investment firm that had swallowed up 3 smaller companies in the past 2 years. He'd read about the last acquisition while waiting for an oil change on his own truck. He couldn't remember why he'd been reading the business pages. He usually didn't. She was wearing a cream blazer over dark trousers, and she walked into his shop the way people walk into spaces they've already decided are beneath them, head slightly tilted back, gaze moving across the walls and tools like she was calculating depreciation. She drove a silver Porsche 911. Thomas had heard it pull up. He'd gone to the door before she knocked because he always heard the cars first. "I was told you're the best in the West End," she said. Not as a compliment, more like an accusation she was still evaluating. Thomas wiped his hands on the rag at his belt. "I try to be," he said. The issue turned out to be a coolant leak, small but the kind that would become expensive fast if left alone. He told her it would take about 40 minutes. She said she'd wait. She didn't sit down. She stood near the window with her phone and typed steadily, the way people do when they want to make it clear they have somewhere more important to be. June came in at 3:20, backpack dragging off one shoulder, a smear of something orange. Marker, probably on her left wrist. She said hi to her dad, dropped her bag on the chair, pulled out her binder. Sylvia Marchetti glanced at her once and went back to her phone. Thomas finished the job in 38 minutes. He was particular about coolant work because a sloppy seal could turn into a blown head gasket, and a blown head gasket could turn into a conversation he never wanted to have with someone who trusted him. He tested it twice. Then he printed the invoice and brought it to the waiting area. "All done," he said. "She's good. You've got a slow leak on the lower hose. I've replaced that, repressurized the system, and checked the reservoir. No other issues." He handed her the invoice. "It's $215. Sylvia Marchetti looked at the paper the way someone looks at a bill they already know they're not going to pay. "This is for 40 minutes of work," she said. 38, actually. "But yes, 215's for less than an hour." She said it flatly. "Not a question. Parts and labor," Thomas said. The hose itself was $62. "The rest is my rate, which is posted at the door." She handed the invoice back to him. Not aggressively. Just returned it the way you return a menu when you've decided you're not ordering. "I'm not paying this," she said. Thomas blinked. In 11 years, a handful of people had tried to negotiate after the fact. 1 or 2 had walked out. Nobody had ever said it quite that directly, quite that cleanly. "I'm not paying this. I'm sorry." The work was straightforward. "I've had this done before for much less." She was already reaching for her keys, his keys, the ones he'd hung on the hook by the counter. "I'll give you $80. That's fair for the time. The hose alone cost me $62, Thomas said. He kept his voice even. He was aware of June at the table. He could feel her awareness of him the way parents can, that peripheral sense of being watched by the one person whose opinion matters most. "That's your overhead," Sylvia said. "Not my problem. I'm not asking you to pay for my overhead. I'm asking you to pay the agreed rate for the work I did on your vehicle. We didn't agree on a rate. It's posted at the door. I didn't see it." He stood very still. There was a version of this conversation where he raised his voice. There was a version where he called her out, where he said something he'd replay with satisfaction later, lying awake. He could see both versions clearly. He chose neither. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm asking you to pay the invoice." She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since she'd walked in, and something in her expression settled into a kind of finality that had nothing to do with him personally. He was just an obstacle she'd decided wasn't worth the friction. "I'll leave you $80 on the counter," she said. "That's more than fair." She put $80 in cash on the counter, took her keys from the hook and walked out. The shop was very quiet. Thomas stood there, holding the invoice. He heard her car start. He heard it pull away. He set the invoice down on the counter with the $80 and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man does when he's trying to keep something inside that has nowhere else to go. Dad. June was looking at him from the table. She'd stopped pretending to do homework at some point. He didn't know exactly when. "Yeah, Bug, why didn't you stop her?" He came around the counter and sat in the chair across from her. The chair wobbled slightly on the uneven floor and he automatically steadied it with his knee, the way he always did. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people make choices that are wrong and there's nothing you can say that'll make them right in that moment. But she took your money. She left $80. That's not the same." "No," he agreed. "It's not." June chewed on the end of her pencil, a habit he kept failing to break her of. "Didn't it make you angry?" He thought about this seriously because she was asking seriously and she deserved that. "Yes," he said, "but I didn't want you to see me lose it over someone like that." June looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her binder. "I think you should have said something. Maybe she was wrong. She was. So why does it get to just end like that? With her driving away?" At the orange marker on her wrist. At the skyline drawing on the wall. "I don't know, Bug," he said. "Sometimes it does." He picked up the invoice, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back to the next job. He didn't sleep well that night. He rarely did, and he'd made a kind of peace with that, the particular insomnia of single parenthood, the 2 a.m. inventory of things undone, school supplies, the leak under the kitchen sink he kept taping, the fact that June had outgrown her winter boots before winter was over, and he'd bought the next size up in February, but they were already feeling snug in April, and he couldn't tell if that was growth or just thicker socks. He lay in the dark and thought about $135, not because $135 would change his life. It wouldn't. He'd been running the shop close to the margin for years, and he knew how to hold a budget together with both hands and a belt. But there was something about $135 taken in that particular way, calmly, deliberately by someone who simply decided she didn't have to, that lodged in him like a piece of grit you can't blink out. He thought about what June had said. Why does it get to just end like that? He didn't have a better answer in the dark. The next morning was gray, the way Toronto mornings in early April often are, a particular flat light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. Thomas opened the shop at 7:30. He made coffee in the small machine on the back shelf. He pulled up the day's schedule on his laptop. A brake job, a tire rotation, a young woman named Britt who'd called 3 times to confirm her appointment because her check engine light had come on the same day her lease renewed, and she was catastrophizing. At 8:45, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled up outside. Thomas didn't recognize the vehicle. He went to the door. The man who got out was in his 70s, tall, still carrying himself straight, wearing a gray sweater and dark trousers. His hair was white and cut short. His hands, when he pushed the door open, were the hands of a man who'd spent some part of his life doing physical work, wide-palmed with blunt fingers, even if the watch on his wrist cost more than Thomas's truck. "Thomas Harding?" the man said. "That's me. My name is Frank Marchetti." He let that sit for a moment. "I believe you met my daughter yesterday." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He kept his expression steady. "I did." Frank Marchetti looked around the shop. Not the way his daughter had, not with that calculating tilt, but slowly, with genuine attention, the way a man looks at something he's actually interested in. He looked at the tools hung in order on the pegboard. He looked at the drawing June had made, still taped to the wall above the radio. "My daughter called me last night," Frank said. "She was complaining about a mechanic who'd overcharged her for a coolant repair. Said the place was overpriced and the guy was rude." He paused. "I asked her how much. She told me. I asked her if she'd paid. She said she'd left what was fair." Thomas waited. "I know my daughter," Frank said, and there was something in his voice that was not apologetic and not defensive. It was the tone of a man who had spent many years seeing someone clearly and hadn't flinched away from what he saw. "She's sharp and she's capable and she has qualities that I'm proud of. But she has a habit when she doesn't want to do something, of deciding it isn't required." He paused. "I called the shop 3 blocks from my office that does her regular servicing. I asked them what they'd charge for a coolant hose replacement on a 911. They said between 210 and 240, depending on parts. Thomas said nothing. Your invoice was $215, Frank said. Yes. Frank reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and produced a folded check. He held it out. Thomas took it. It was made out to Thomas Harding. The amount was not $135. It was not a gesture or a top-up. Thomas looked at the number for a long moment. He looked up. Mr. Marchetti, my father came to this country in 1961, Frank said. He worked at a steel mill in Hamilton for 22 years. He had a shop like this one later, not cars, appliances, but same idea. He told me once that the hardest thing about honest work wasn't the work. It was the people who looked at it like it didn't count. He looked at the drawing on the wall again. That your daughter's? Yes, she's got a good eye. Thomas looked at the check again. The number was $18,000. Not the $135 he was owed and not some token gesture at twice that. $18,000 in neat handwriting, with the date at the top in Frank Marchetti's careful hand. I can't accept this, Thomas said. Frank looked at him. Why not? This isn't what I'm owed. I know what it is, Frank said. I know exactly what it is. He slid his hands into his pockets. I've been looking to invest in small businesses in this neighborhood for the past year. My daughter manages the firm now, but I still have capital I deploy myself. I've been in 6 shops, 4 restaurants, 2 trades operations, looking for people worth backing. He looked around the shop one more time. I think I found one. Thomas stood very still. This isn't charity, Frank said. I don't do charity. I do investment. I'll want a written agreement, standard terms, reasonable return timeline. Your lawyer looks at it, my lawyer looks at it. This is business. He paused. But it starts with this check, which covers the money my daughter owes you. And a great deal more besides, because I believe in paying for what something is actually worth. Thomas looked at the check for a long time. He looked at the name at the top. He looked at the number. He thought about June and her question in the quiet shop the afternoon before. Why does it get to just end like that? I need to think about it, Thomas said. Frank nodded slowly. That's the right answer, he said. A man who grabs a check from a stranger without thinking about it isn't someone I want to invest in anyway. He pulled a card from his pocket and set it on the counter. Call me when you've thought about it. Take a few days. He started for the door. Then he stopped. For what it's worth, Frank said without turning around. My daughter told me you stayed calm the whole time, that you didn't make a scene. He paused. I asked her how she knew you weren't just afraid of her. She said she didn't know. He glanced back then, just briefly. I think you can guess what I told her. He left. Thomas stood in the shop alone. The door swung shut. The gray morning light came through the window at the same flat angle it had all morning. He set the check on the counter next to his coffee cup. He looked at it for a while. Then he called his brother in Barry, because that was who he always called when he needed to think out loud. His brother didn't pick up, which was also common, so Thomas left a long voicemail that probably didn't make full sense, because he was still processing. Then he poured the rest of his cold coffee down the sink and started the brake job. He picked June up from school that afternoon. She got in the passenger side and dropped her bag in the back seat with a thud that suggested a difficult day, and he didn't ask about it right away because she needed about 4 minutes of driving before she was ready to talk. He'd learned this. He'd learned a lot of small things like this over 9 years. At the second red light, she said, Did anything happen today? Yeah, Thomas said. Something happened. She looked at him. Something good or something weird? Both, I think. She turned in her seat. Tell me. So he told her. He told her about Frank Marchetti coming in that morning, about the Lincoln Navigator, about the things Frank had said about his father, about the steel mill, about honest work. He told her about the check and the number on it and what Frank had said it was for. June was quiet for a long time. So the lady's dad came back, she said slowly, to fix what she did, in a manner of speaking. Is it real? Like, is the check real? I haven't deposited it yet. But yes, I believe it's real. She chewed on this, not her pencil, just the idea of it. Are you going to take it? What's there to think about? Thomas smiled. The terms, the agreement, whether I trust him. Whether it's actually an investment or whether there's something else going on I don't understand yet. But do you think he's a good person? Thomas thought about Frank's hands, about the way he'd looked at the drawing on the wall, about the specific weight of the sentence. I believe in paying for what something is actually worth. Yeah, Thomas said. I think he is. June looked out the window. They were in the neighborhood now, past the park, 2 blocks from home. She watched the houses go by. I'm glad, she said simply. Thomas glanced at her. Yesterday you said sometimes it just ends with the wrong person driving away, June said. I was thinking about that last night. I didn't like it. Neither did I. But it didn't end there, she said. It just took longer. He pulled into the driveway. He turned the engine off. He sat there for a moment in the silence of the car. Yeah, he said. It just took longer. He called his brother back that evening after June went to bed. This time Kevin picked up, and Thomas explained everything more coherently. Kevin, who had the particular gift of getting immediately to the point, said, "Do you want to do this?" Thomas thought about the shop, about the pegboard of tools and the table with the bolted leg and the sign he'd been meaning to repaint. He thought about the lease coming up for renewal in 14 months. He thought about the conversation he'd been half avoiding about whether to hire on a second mechanic, which he needed but couldn't quite justify, not alone. "Yeah," Thomas said. "I think I do. Then call him in the morning," Kevin said, "and get a lawyer." "I know. An actual lawyer, Tom. Not your buddy Greg who did your will." "Greg is a legitimate, Thomas." "Yeah, okay. A different lawyer." He called Frank Marchetti the next morning at 9 o'clock. Frank answered on the second ring, which Thomas later came to understand was simply how Frank operated. Present, direct, no performance around it. They met at a coffee shop on Bloor Street 3 days later. Frank came with a short set of terms. Thomas came with a list of questions his brother had helped him write and 2 things he wasn't willing to compromise on. They went back and forth for an hour. Frank pushed on one point. Thomas held the line. Frank nodded and said, "Fair enough," and that was that. Thomas's lawyer looked at the agreement and said it was solid. Frank's terms were straightforward: modest equity stake, no operational control, a return timeline that allowed the business to grow without bleeding itself. The $18,000 would go toward equipment upgrades and the second mechanic he'd needed for 2 years. He signed the papers on a Friday afternoon. He called his mother that night. His parents were in Sudbury. And his mother had the habit of asking about the shop as though it were a child itself, a third party she worried about. And he told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have liked this story." Thomas asked why. "Because the part where you stayed quiet," she said. He always said that the hardest thing wasn't being good when people were watching. It was being good when they weren't. He sat with that for a while after he hung up. He thought about Sylvia Marchetti. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something more complicated and harder to name. He didn't know what she'd felt when her father told her what he'd done. He didn't know if she'd understood, or if understanding was even available to her in the way it was available to other people. He hoped it was. That was the most he could manage. He thought about Frank standing in his shop, looking at June's drawing. The careful way he'd looked at it, not politely, the way you look at a child's drawing because you're supposed to appreciate it, but actually, the way you look at something that tells you something true. He thought about June in the car saying, "It just took longer." 6 months after Frank Marchetti walked into the shop on Dundas Street West, Thomas hired a second mechanic, a young woman named Bev who'd been doing mobile repairs out of a van for 3 years and was ready for a real bench. He repainted the sign above the door. He replaced the table with the bolted leg. He left the drawing where it was. He and Frank had coffee once a month, sometimes at the Bloor Street place, sometimes at the shop. Frank rarely talked business in those meetings. He talked about Hamilton, about his father, about the neighborhood in ways that made Thomas realize how long you could love a place and still feel like you were still figuring it out. One afternoon in October, when the light had gone golden and early and the shop was quiet after a full day, Frank sat in the chair where June usually did her homework and looked at the skyline drawing on the wall. "Who did she draw it as?" he asked. "I don't know," Thomas said. "I never asked." Frank looked at it for another moment. "You should ask her." That evening, Thomas showed June the drawing. She'd forgotten it was there, mostly the way you forget the things you've taped up long enough, and he asked her whose skyline it was. She looked at it for a second. "It's ours," she said, as if this should have been obvious. "It's just the city. It's Toronto." Thomas looked at the drawing, at the irregular shapes she'd made with a thick marker in the particular hand of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that things needed to look like the thing they were representing in order to be worth looking at. "Yeah," he said, "it is." He left it on the wall.